Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 169 of Into the Outer Realms, my special series. This is only the third episode of this special series. I call it Parallels, Patterns, and Pathways. And I'm really focusing, I think for pretty obvious reasons, on the UFO phenomena, disclosure, the secret government, so on and so forth. I pulled out some props tonight to sort of invoke the trope of the 1950s, 1960s undercover shady CIA officer, because this is where this story takes us tonight. It takes us to Cuba during Fidel Castro's early reign, and Bay of Pigs, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and so on and so forth. It takes us to the time, especially of Ike and of Kennedy. But we're going to begin after I roll the opening. We're going to begin 20 years, exactly 20 years after the Kennedy assassination, when this weird microfilm and other files start showing up in UFO researchers' mailboxes. So, welcome to the show. I'm really happy to have you here tonight. This is a very important series to me. Think about last week's House Oversight hearings, where there's a lot of talk about Congress not getting access, the president not getting access, things being taken over by these aerospace contractors and military contractors, and upper level people even not getting access. And tonight is another piece of the puzzle of saying this began not anytime recently, but really it began about 80 years ago or more. That's what I'm going to share with you tonight. So glad you're here.
There exists a realm beyond our wildest dreams, a realm beyond reality that the gatekeepers and guardians have always told us consists of nothing but tricks of the eye, weather balloons, swamp gas, sand cranes, fairy tale myths of monsters, crackpot conspiracy theories, and desperate cries for attention.
We know this realm exists, and it's just beyond the horizon. The preset path, the well-worn walkways where the cynics want us to stay.
Instead, give this a listen. Put on your headphones, adjust your volume, close your eyes, and fasten your mental seatbelts, because the twilight-tinged turnoff from reality's alluring highway is looming just ahead.
We're about to leave the plane of the easily explained, couldn't possibly be's, and the no way I just saw what I saw's, for the spaces and places where everything is possible, and if you stay long enough, even probable. We're about to take a journey into the outer realms.
All right, so much to cover tonight, and it has a little bit of everything, including Marilyn Monroe. So, if I begin, before I begin, I will definitely begin. Not if I begin. If I finish is another question, but we will keep our fingers crossed. I like to give credit where credit is due. As all of you probably know, I've become very close with Reverend Michael Carter. You may know him, hopefully, from our show. Definitely from Three Beards podcast, and also, of course, from television, from Ancient Aliens, where he is a very popular guest. And he turned me on to this book that I highly recommend if you're into what I'm going to talk about tonight. It's called Kennedy's Last Stand, Eisenhower, UFOs, MJ-12, and JFK's Assassination. It's by Michael Salla, PhD, Dr. Salla. Basically, here's how I'll explain it. Even though I've been looking into all of this for the last 5 or 6 years, I had a lot of pieces of cloth, and he provided the thread that put really all those crossed together for me so clearly. This book is just full of URLs. A lot of the documents that I'm going to talk about tonight are available online through FOIA and a lot of the good work of our brothers and sisters who are doing those requests and then digitizing those things through the CIA programs of disclosure. There's a lot out there, FBI, so on and so forth. A lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight, when you talk to the insiders, the Beltway people and the gatekeepers, they're going to tell you that it's all BS and none of it is real. We're seeing that play out. You have people like David Grush, very, very high-level intelligence person. I had read the interviews, I had seen some clips, but watching him talk to Congress for 2.5 hours off and on last week really opened to my eyes to the fact that this guy knows his stuff. He can quote chapter and verse. It was quite impressive, and I believed him. His body gestures, the way he moved his eyes, the way he spoke, his tonality, his syntax, everything. I believe the guy. Yet the head of Arrow, right, that impossible to decipher, to remember, looking the last iteration, looking into this through the Pentagon, the head, Sean Patrick, said it was insulting what Gresh was saying, and he should be embarrassed and none of it was real. So here we are. So what we're going to try to do is continue to give you the bits and pieces that you need to see that this is not just happening now, that it really goes back. But let's start now in 1983. I'm going to unfold a bit of a mystery for you, which will sound, as it does to so many people, like hogwash, like BS. But then I'm going to go all the way back to the late 40s and work my through up to 1963 November, when Kennedy was assassinated, and hopefully present a very coherent case that this very mysterious thing called MJ-12, Majestic-12, was quite real, and that the roots of it are still controlling what goes on, where the money flows, where the technology is being held up rather than shared at this very perilous time in American and world history. So there you go. So in 1983, there's an author, Charles Berlitz. Now, he's written books about Roswell, about the Philadelphia experiment, highly respected and a bit of a ufologist insider. And he receives 35 millimeter film purporting to be about something called MJ-12, Majestic-12. Well, fast forward almost a full year to December of 1984, and there is this film director producer named Jamie Shandera, and he's working on this fictional UFO movie based in fact. He's hoping that people like Stanton Friedman, the eminent physicist and ufologist, guy like people like Bill Moore, who really was an insider, who co-wrote books with Charles Berlitz, but as I've exposed on this show in the past, was actually a shill, an operative for the Air Force Office of Special Investigation, and the guy I've talked a lot about, Richard Doty, and he was infiltrating and causing problems. It's very COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program, very 1950s, very 1960s. It was used to try to destroy the civil rights movement, the Black Panthers, the Students for a Democratic Society, so on and so forth. Anyway, Shandera wants these guys to consult on the movie, to give it legitimacy, but also to get insider information. Shandera, out of nowhere, receives in his mailbox an undeveloped roll of 35 millimeter film. It's got an Albuquerque, New Mexico postmark. So Albuquerque, hotbed of all of this UFO kind of stuff. Moore had introduced to Shandera to Doty. So at this point, people are going, I wonder if it's Richard Doty turning tail or outing, being a whistleblower. What exactly is going on here, right? It's 8 pages of documents about this MJ-12. And it was a report that was prepped for Eisenhower in November of 1952. And I'm going to get to that. Now, fast forward another year, 1985, and Friedman and Moore start to receive a series of anonymous messages leading them to something called the Cutler-Twining Memo. It's available. It's out there. You can read it. And I'm telling you, when you look it up, there's going to be lots of people who tell you that it's all BS and it's phony. but they're digging through the National Archives, and that's where they find it. Now, could it be planted in the archives? Yeah, okay, we got to be healthy skeptics. Maybe it could be. So it's purportedly written by Ike's assistant, Robert Cutler, to General Nathan Twining, and I'm going to be talking about Twining a lot tonight, with reference again to MJ-12. 3 years, 3 different researchers, this persistent documentation, and talk of this thing called Majestic-12. Now, it also comes out at this time, and people didn't know it for decades, that Nathan Twining headed the disinformation campaign in the UFO community. This was a stick that was then taken up, a baton that was then taken up by Richard Doty at the Air Force Office of Special Investigations that I've talked about so much. All right, now let's go 7 years forward to 1992. Photographed copies of documents from someone using the pseudonym Thomas Cantwell are received by another ufologist, the 5th one in this string, called Timothy Cooper. He'd grown up near White Sands Missile Range. I'll also talk about that a couple times as we go along merrily tonight. And he was filing FOIA requests to get this information. Someone was aware of it. Whoever this person is that's feeding these Majestic-12 documents, and to this day, we don't know who it is sending them now to all these people. 2 of those documents are called the White Hot Intelligence Estimate, written by Twining again, and the Majestic-12 Project First Annual Report, which I have read in detail in a book by Joseph P. Farrell. So these things are available. I would encourage you to go out and read them if you want to deep dive into this stuff. Fast forward 2 more years. Now a 6th ufologist, Don Berliner, receives undeveloped film, and this has what's called the Psalm 101 Special Operations Manual. I will tell you more about that when I go back in time. 5 years later, we're back to Timothy Cooper, and he receives partially burned memo that has 2 things. It links counterintelligence head James Jesus Angleton to the Kennedy assassination, authorized by Allen Dulles, ex-head of the CIA, very, very powerful person aligned with the Rockefellers, so on and so forth, and also, at one point, the head, MJ1, of this Majestic-12. Okay? 2014, the very, very controversial, but I'm sticking with the man. I'm sticking with him, but the very, very controversial Stephen Greer receives even more documents. He claims that Mike Wallace has now received all of these documents, but he cannot do a 60 Minutes piece like he wants to because of pressure from CBS corporate. I will tell you, over the years, as stories have come out about the tobacco companies, other things, CBS corporate was really blocking people from like Mike Wallace and other hosts from doing some of these shows or spinning them the way they wanted to. And I have insider information from someone who was on one of the highest rated episodes of 60 Minutes ever that Mike Wallace could do some manipulation as well. So there you go. Richard Dolan, the UFO historian, who I very much trust and like, has said that the MJ-12 documents are real. Stanton Friedman said that these documents were real. Richard Doty has been the one that everybody has pointed to and said this is the origin point for these things. But he denies that he links them, that he leaked them, and he claims to have been investigated by the FBI and the Office of Special Investigation that he used to work for when the documents were leaked, and he was found not to be the leaker. So there you go. Okay, now let's go back in time. I am going to try to go through this pretty quickly, and please keep in mind that in this series, Parallels, Patterns, and Pathways, I will be duplicating information. It's just the nature of it. To talk about Ike and the aliens, traverses several decades. To talk about Majestic, well, we start in 1941 and we go all the way up to modern times or 2005. So when I do the 1940s episode, when I do the 1950s, when I do the 1960s episode, you're going to hear these names as you have in the past: Doty, Twining, so on and so forth. That is the idea. I'm doing that on purpose to build this historical tapestry or to build this water bladder that very much holds water. Okay, so let's go through this. It gets very interesting, and I hope very eye-opening for you all at certain places. In October of 1941, John F. Kennedy begins service as an ensign in naval intelligence. This is through a request of his wealthy and powerful father, former ambassador to Britain, Joseph Kennedy. He made this request in August that upon graduation, JFK would be assigned to naval intelligence, very powerful as it is now, along with the Navy research labs. And so it is. So it happens. Now, about 5 months later, naval intelligence retrieves a crashed UFO after the LA air raid, which is fairly well known in ufology. Now, this is related to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, March 5th, by Chief of Staff of the Army, George Marshall. So that seems to hold water. There was this battle over LA. One of the ships crashes and naval intelligence gets it. Well, who is now a part of naval intelligence? John F. Kennedy. Now, at the time, the Undersecretary of the Navy is James Forrestal. And I have talked about James Forrestal a lot on the show, and I will continue to. He is a key piece of this puzzle. Now, this George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, formed something called the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, interplanetary, within the Army's Intelligence Division, otherwise known as G2. A couple years later, Forrestal is promoted to Secretary of the Navy. He is now in charge of the Navy. In the next couple months later, he tenders an offer to JFK. He says, join my personal staff. But I think because of Joseph and his larger plans for JFK to eventually become no less than President of the United States, joining Forrestal's staff would be somewhat of a dead end for him. That wouldn't work. They have other plans for him. But JFK does go with Forrestal to Germany. This is in 1945. He meets General Eisenhower there. He meets Truman. He meets Churchill. Now, during this time, a lot is going on. The world is being divvied up. Things are being decided post-World War II. Paperclip, Operation Paperclip. Craig and I did a whole show on that. Is approved, bringing over committed Nazis like Werner von Braun, who I also talk about all the time. Now, as I mentioned last week on Ike and the Aliens, Ike and Churchill, about 3 years earlier, had covered up an RAF UFO sighting in Britain. So Truman certainly knew the truth about UFOs. Forrestal knew. Probably Jack Kennedy knew. So all these people constellating together, Eisenhower, okay, they all know. Keep that in mind. Well, did the Germans have anything? Did they see anything over there? In my Dangers of Disclosure episode from about a year ago, I uncovered some evidence that said, yes, very much the Nazis had the program. Also, I touched on it in our Sinister Mysteries Nazi and the Occult episode. Rocket pioneer Herman Oberth, who came over through Operation Paperclip, said this: we cannot take credit for our record advancement in certain scientific fields alone. We have been helped by people from other worlds. It sounds a hell of a lot like what Ben Rich from Skunkworks, Lockheed Martin, said in the 1980s, saying we have the technology to bring ET home, and we have been helped in different ways. So there you go. Now, November 15th, 1945, Ike is appointed U.S. Army Chief of Staff. A year later, the following November, JFK is elected to Congress. So these guys are domestic and they keep going up the ladder and they know about UFOs. So July 7th, 1947, I've uncovered a lot of research recently, and some thanks to Dr. Sala here, that who was ultimately behind the cover-up of Roswell, a name that doesn't get mentioned a lot, but Army Chief of Staff Eisenhower. He knows these things are a problem, and he wants it buried. So he directs General Nathan Twining, who's head of the Material Command at Wright Air Force Base, later Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, to travel to Alamogordo Army Airfield. Remember, the Air Force does not exist yet, and it later becomes Holloman Air Force Base, where Ike had some of his ET meetings, and he says, I want you to write up a report. Now, while he's at Alamogordo, Twining sees the wreckage of the Roswell crafts. A couple days later, Truman directs Twining to report to Ike. So it goes secular. Eisenhower is well aware from the generals and all who are really at the top of this thing, Roger Ramey and so forth. He goes to Twining, says, Twining, hey, write this report on site. Twining has firsthand knowledge. And then he takes it to Truman, and Truman says, tell Ike. So already things are, things are a little shaky in the communication and command between the military and the executive branch. So 6 days later, Hoover, and you can find this again online, Hoover writes a handwritten note. We must insist upon full access to discs recovered, not weather balloons, not crash test dummies, not any kind of nonsense, but full access to discs recovered. For instance, in the LA case, right, LA raids way back in 1942, the Army grabbed it and would not let us have it for cursory examination. So the military, the FBI are not getting along. Already there's compartmentalization and all of that. Yeah, Tanya says that Mike Wallace talked about being hogtied if there were things they didn't want him to talk about. But he was a very clever guy too. So July 22nd, 1947. So this is all in Roswell aftermath. This is clicking off fast, folks, in 47, which I told you about in the Ike and the Aliens episode. The Counterintelligence Corps, or again, the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, publish a report. JFK is briefed at this point about Roswell through his connections with Forrestal, who has taken him on as his protege. And then a couple months later, the guy who made that report to JFK, the Assistant Secretary of War for Air, Stuart Symington, is promoted to Secretary of the Air Force. There is a pattern in NASA, I'll talk about, in the military, guys who are insiders about these things. One of two things happen. If they can keep their mouth shut, they continue to get promoted, right? Jesse Marcel, who came out and said, look, we had this spongy material. I showed it to my son. All these kinds of things. He was not drummed out of the service. He continued to get promoted in very positive ways, getting more and more power. Okay. So, meantime, September 24th, so this is all within a couple months, right? Truman writes a memo to Forrestal, who is now the newly appointed Secretary of the Defense, okay, newly created position. And he talks about Majestic-12. Forrestal is in, I believe, the third position. He is MJ3 in this council of 12 people who are going to be the powerful gatekeepers of all UFO crash, retrieval, so on and so forth information. At that meeting, plus there's a meeting, right? So there's the memo, but that same day, there's purported to be a meeting. Truman invites in Forrestal and Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was a high-level science advisor running a lot of science programs for the government and the military. So here are the original 12 members of what is called Majestic-12, the UFO gatekeepers. There's Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter. Now, he's the director of the CIA. Alan Dulles, when he becomes director of the CIA, will take that number one position, MJ1, which will become very important in Kennedy's story and his truncated life. Dr. Bush is on it. He's number 2. Forrestal, Twining, who I talked about, Hoyt Vandenberg, named an Air Force base about him in California that's had a hell of a lot of UFO activity. 2 scientists, Detlev Bronk and Jerome Hunsiker, Admiral Sidney Sowers, Gordon Gray, Dr. Donald Menzel, remember that name, General Robert Montague, and Dr. Lloyd Berkner. So basically, it's high up intelligence people, high up military people, high up scientists make this ad hoc. Okay, so they put it together just to study this thing because crazy stuff is happening. You have the crash in Roswell, you have 2 crash sites, all of this. This is around the same time through Majestic-12 that the Special Operations Manual, Psalm 1-1, Extraterrestrial Entities and Technology Recovery and Disposal is created. Lots of people have talked about this, talked about it on the show. You can find a PDF on it online, Special Operations Manual, or look up SOM 1-1 and you'll find the PDF. Okay, still in 1947, believe it or not, in October, Brigadier General George Shulgin, who is chief of the Air Intelligence Requirements Division, writes a memo. And a part of that memo lists requirements in the field of flying saucer type craft. They were taking this all very seriously in 1947, and they had hints of it not only from the Britain incident and things like the Foo Fighters, but the things that they had found in Germany and were starting to bring over through paperclip. Okay, Nathan Twining writes Shulgin a memo saying that the phenomena were not visionary or fictitious, but that they were real. All these little factoids, all these little inner checks that this stuff is true. And people like Kirkpatrick and these other people and NASA who are saying nothing to see, nothing exists to this very day, this very hour, are full of crap. Okay? Because the data is actually not on their side. Truman had 18 briefings from 1948 to 1952 with Major General Robert Landry, who was the USAF aide to the White House. 18 briefings over 4 years about the UFO issue. This was a hot button, very serious topic. Why? Well, in 1948, there is another crash in March of 25 in Aztec, New Mexico. It's sometimes referred to as the other Roswell, another flying saucer. It's a 99.99 diameter silver disc, 2 bodies in the cockpit. So now we have the Roswell bodies, we have these bodies, 14 others in the midsection of the ship stationed around the perimeter. So now we got 16 EBEs here, and the craft is brought to Los Alamos. Okay, so the cover up and compartmentalization is really now beginning. About a year later, almost exactly a year later, Forrestal is fired by Truman because Forrestal has had it. He wants this information out to the public. It is a real danger. People need to know about it. And so they put him in the crazy ward at Bethesda Mental Hospital. He's not allowed to see anybody. 2 people he doesn't want to see come to visit him. One is Harry Truman, the president, and the other one is a congressman from Texas called Lyndon B. Johnson. Okay, what was discussed? What was going on? We don't know, but Forrestal was not happy to see them. He wanted to see a couple of priests. He wanted to see his brother Harry. He was denied those things until the very, very end. And as I've talked about before numerous times on this show, 2 days before his brother is supposed to pick him up, and actually it's 2 hours before his brother is supposed to pick him up, he jumps out a window. No, he was pushed, and it probably had to do with Sidney Gottlieb and the fledgling CIA and all of that, taking care of business and being gatekeepers at the behest of the CIA. Remember, Admiral Hillenkoetter is the director of Central Intelligence. Okay, now Forrestal is gone. JFK's mentor, his insider guy, is dead. Out a window, dead at Bethesda Naval Hospital. Okay, in 1950, Project Bluebird, which later became Artichoke, and Project Chatter are developed. They are programs designed to condition agency personnel, agency being the CIA, against interrogation, to investigate interrogation techniques and explore memory enhancement. I think this has a lot to do what we know now is coming out more and more about MILABs, military abductions, staged abductions to drive people crazy, discredit them, send them a message using alien replica vehicles or technology that's been developed through reverse engineering. It starts in 1950 with these CIA programs. Well, in October of that year, a man named General Walter B. Smith joins MJ-12, replacing Forrestal. So it took about a year and a half to replace him. So they're being very, very careful about who they're allowing to sit on this council. And for years and years and years, about half of the council, there's no movement at all. The scientists tend to stay. Now, in 1951, Truman sets up the Psychology Strategy Board for Cold War PSYOPs. Cold War is cold because it's all about psychological ops. It's all about one-upsmanship. It's all about the arms race. Then it becomes about the space race. And it's also about disinformation campaigns, control of information, what is going on in the darkness as opposed to what's going on in the light. Craig Ansel, my partner in crime for Sinister Mysteries, will be back next week to work on something called Sinister 40 with you all. He says they were Kissinger puppets, and a lot of them absolutely were, brother. I tell you that. Now, let's go across the border. In November of 1951, the Canadians, who have been much more upfront about UFOs than the United States has, a communication specialist says in a top secret memo, not only that UFOs exist, but the U.S. has a small dedicated group studying these under the scientist Dr. Vannevar Bush. If you have any doubts about MJ-12 and its authenticity, right there in 1951, it is outed by a Canadian communication specialist. All right, that's all you need to look at, but there's plenty more, so stick around. In 1952, there are 3 top secret memos from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's titled The Joint Logistic Plan for Majestic. There you go again. There are 3 parts to this: PSYOPs, unconventional warfare, and cover and deception. At this time, MJ-12 is based out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Remember, the Air Force has been created by this time, and it's right there, the Joint Logistic Plan for Majestic. How we're going to use PSYOPs, how we're going to use unconventional warfare, which is also my labs, fake abductions, false flags, all of that kind of stuff, the kind of things that Doty was doing, professional, hired, cynic Philip Klass was doing, so on and so forth. In fall of 1952, as I alluded to in the opening, the Majestic-12 Project First Annual Report comes out. You can get your hands on it. Go ahead and read it. November 4th, 1952, National Security Agency is created. The next day, Ike wins in a landslide for president. I am convinced that these guys with insider information, there's a string of them, okay? Eisenhower, Kennedy, Nixon, so on and so forth. These guys are super, super insiders. So get them in that position, try to control them as best as you can. Give them a little bit of power and keep a damn close eye on them. And if they F up, get rid of them, okay? So November 18th, 2 weeks after Ike wins for presidency, he gets his first classified briefings, including the MJ-12 documents that were sent to those ufologists all those years later, 30-some years later. Okay. 2 days after he gets this briefing is the famous George Adamski case. Now, I can't go into this in detail tonight. I'll try to go into it when I do the decade of the 1950s having to do with UFOs. In Desert Center, California, George Adamski sees a cigar-shaped scout ship piloted by EBE named Orthon, who's from Venus. There are 6 witnesses. 4 days later, a series of photos are actually published in the Phoenix Gazette, although that following December, about a month later, the photos are debunked and they say, no, it's just a surgical lamp. It's not a UFO. Okay, well, does Adamski go away? Is Adamski discredited? Far from. He receives a papal gold medallion from John the 23rd, the Pope. And you can't get these things and you can't buy them. So this was for the work he was doing, contact with EBEs. He also goes on to brief not only the Pentagon, but European leaders. And as you'll see in a little bit, he has contact with John F. Kennedy. Okay. January 24th, 1953, Eisenhower is now president. He issues Executive Order 10432. I try to give you as much detail on this program as possible so you can go and look this stuff up. This is the Advisory Committee on Government Organization. Ike tasked Nelson Rockefeller. Talk about not a Kissinger puppet. Nelson Rockefeller is way too powerful for that. The Rockefellers have been involved in the United Fruit Company, in the Banana Republics, in the overthrow of Central American governments, tied to what happened in Cuba, and all that is going on with that, which I've also talked about on the show and will continue to, because it's really important. And Craig and I also, through Condor, talked about Kissinger and a lot of this kind of stuff. Okay, so he tasked Nelson Rockefeller with restructuring the government. What does that wind up being? Not better for you guys, not less government and more efficiency. It's about compartmentalization. It's about the strengthening of the military and the intelligence organizations, because we have this damn serious problem called UFOs with crashes and visits and every other damn thing. Now, at this point, Hillenkoetter is replaced by Dulles. Edward Teller becomes a big part of this. He becomes very important for Area 51 and S4. Walter Smith gives way to Marshall Carter. Twining remains. Vandenberg gives way to a guy named Gordon Blake. Bronk and Hussinger stay on. Sidney Sowers gives way to Lawrence Frost. Gray and Menzel stay on, and Robert Montague gives way to John Stanford. Berkner stays on as well. So like I said, most of the scientists stayed put for a good bit of time, but the military guys, they retire, they leave the CIA, they go on to other things, and so on and so forth. So also in 1953, through MJ-12, there's a program created called Project Aquarius. This is specifically to glean alien technology from crashed and retrieved UFOs. Okay. There's also something called Project Moondust, which has an elite UFO recovery team. This same year, something is created called the Air Intelligence Service Squadrons, which are rapid response units, which may have been the basis for MIBs. Did the very first show, Parallels, Patterns, and Pathways, on those guys, the MIBs. So April 3rd of 1953, Artichoke, this interrogation, false operations, withstanding interrogation, giving it all these kinds of things, gets folded into MK Ultra. MK Ultra continues to be the one topic that I'm asked the most about, that I do the most presentations and appearances. And it was Craig and I together on Manson Mitchell Radio, but prior to that on Sinister Mysteries. That was our very first, that was our inaugural MK Ultra. I invite you, if you haven't seen it or you want to revisit it, you can find it on my YouTube channel. Also in 1953, Lockheed head Kelly Johnson, who goes on to create Skunkworks with all the secret planes, writes a letter to Allen Dulles, who's newly appointed head of the CIA, and reports that a UFO was parked over his house. This is a very high-level guy in the aeronautical field. Why the hell would we be writing letters about UFOs if there weren't any over his house, right? So let's get into 1954 here. In February, Eisenhower makes MJ-12 permanent. Now, he has a whole gaggle of powerful people around him. He has Allen Dulles. He has Nelson Rockefeller. He has several powerful generals. He has Allen Dulles. They're all around him, but then there's this MJ-12, and he says, okay, let's make it permanent because we have this real problem on our hands that we need to control. He makes Nelson Rockefeller head of Cold War planning. It's right on with government restructuring. It's right on the interplanetary unit. It's on with all of these things, and he's overseeing all of it. And he's working with something closely called the CIA Directorate of Plans. That is headed up by a guy named Robert Bissell, and he's going to become very important in this story. That same year, James Jesus Angleton becomes head of the CIA counterintelligence operation. All of these guys are taking power under Eisenhower's mandate to Rockefeller, through Dulles and so on and so forth, to restructure and compartmentalize the government. Okay, July 14th, 1954. Cutler Twining memo. This is where it happens in real time, indicating there would be an MJ-12 meeting on July 16th at the White House. So Eisenhower's meeting with these 12 very powerful people right in the Oval Office, right in the White House. Rockefeller then restructures MJ-12 around this time. He appoints Dulles as MJ-1, the head of operations, which is as right as the head of the CIA. Okay. Later that year into 1955, as I talked about in detail last week, so I won't go into it again, it's the Greada Treaty. It's the Eisenhower meetings where he disappears. He winds up at Edwards Air Force Base. He winds up at Holloman, and all of the deals are struck. So Ike is now in it up to his eyeballs. They are here. They are striking deals. They were offering technology, and all of these different things are in place in what's fast becoming a secret or shadow or elite government, what we talk about today as the deep state. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater if you're really, really anti-Trump. This idea of the deep state has really nothing to do with him. He was just talking about it as somewhat as an outsider. So let's take a breath. I'm going to take a little sip of iced tea here. We're doing very well. We're doing very well. Let's talk about Area 51. First thing I want to tell you about Area 51 is that this is not a military installation. This is a CIA operation. April 12th, 1955, Kelly Johnson, who, saw a UFO over his house, does a flyover as head of Lockheed Martin, and he identifies this area around Groom Lake, Papoose Lake with the dry lake bed, isolated, all of this kind of stuff as the perfect place for testing spy planes. Now, the testing range, the larger testing range, had formerly been Department of Energy, Atomic Energy Council land. This was something that Leslie Groves, who was the general for the Manhattan Project, if you've seen Oppenheimer, if you see it, played by Matt Damon, very prevalent. He headed up from the military perspective. Manhattan Project did not want this in the hands of the government, but he did not get his way. So Area 51 is set up by this Robert Bissell, who is the CIA head of the Directorate of Plans. Okay. Tanya says that blew her mind. It surprised me too. Area 51, not a military installation, CIA installation, because the U-2 spy plane was a CIA project. I first learned that when I read Ben Rich's autobiography. Excuse me. So CIA is testing the U-2 at Area 51, Groom Lake dry lake bed. The AR-12 comes after it, the Blackbird, SR-71, all around 1962, all while Kennedy is president and fighting against all of this stuff, as you will see. Now, by 1968, 5 years after Kennedy's death, when people like Nixon through Kissinger and so on and so forth, and the remnants and shadows and echoes of powerful people like Dulles, Rockefeller linked, are totally in control. The soul of the country is lost. And Craig and I are going to do a JFK assassination episode where I'll give you a lot of this in depth. But I truly believe it was the killing of the king at the 33rd parallel, Freemasonry and everything else, very symbolic killing to end Camelot, to end the soul of this country. Not that Kennedy was perfect, but he was pretty damn good as far as what he and his brother was doing. His brother also not perfect, and they were killed for it, both of them. Okay. By 1968, this whole entire area is dedicated to black projects to the tune of $30 billion a year. As you know, because it came up in the hearings last week, again, the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, and of course, by extension, the CIA and all the rest, the military-industrial complex, fails their audits year after year after the year to the tunes of hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars. And when Craig and I talk about 9/11, another thing that we're going to tackle on Sinister Mysteries, we will also talk about Rumsfeld's announcement a couple of days before that an audit was being done in the Pentagon to try to find this missing trillions of dollars, and it's exactly where the Pentagon was hit, okay? So there's a part, it's about a few miles south of Groom Lake, near Papoose Lake, a very shadowy thing that I've talked about before. I believe I talked about it a little last week, called S4. Okay, so Dr. Dan Burish worked with ETs called J-Rods there. I believe I shared that last week. He was also working with MJ-12. They recruited Dr. Burish. He got a spot at State University of New York through Edward Teller, MJ-12, who was also Atomic Energy Commission. And Teller also got Bob Lazar his start at McCarran, EG&G, and at S4. And there's a meme going around of Bob Lazar that simply says, "I told you so." And he did. He told us. He told us 30 some years ago almost that this was real, that S4 existed, and they tried to burn him. They denied that he existed. They denied that his documents, his credentials were real. And through George Knapp, who was a white hat good guy at the time, I'm not sure I feel that way anymore. I think he got caught with the shiny thing. Anyway, got hooked by it. So that was that. There are supposedly 5 levels to S4. I'm not going to go into great detail. Level 1 is 9 hangars that store recovered craft. Level 3 is living quarters for MJ-12 when they all meet there. So they move from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and they move further out, much more isolated, rather than right here in Ohio, where Tanya and I were just a couple weeks ago out around Dayton. Level 4 is Alice's floor, where there's a 3-foot tall white rabbit statue. It supposedly has Einstein Rosen bridges, a Stargate jump pads, and it is called the Looking Glass. Through Guriata Treaty technology and all the rest, and reverse engineering and EBE cooperation, they had all this stuff, just like Lazar and Burish and other guys, Clifford Stone and so on and so forth, have been telling us. Now, supposedly in the 1980s, according to Stephen Grillo, Russians actually worked at S4, but they were banned after a substantial breakthrough. If you remember Craig and I doing Pine Gap, the Australians, after things got very, very, very interesting, according to the U.S. military-industrial complex, were no longer allowed in certain laboratories and sections of their own friggin' installation in Australia, Pine Gap. So that's how the game is played. More substantiation there. So Ike, by this time, is shut out of Area 51. He's shut out of S4. Okay, his reps are receiving some UFO reports from the Air Force Base at Fort Belvoir. And what we learned from this time is that Project Blue Book was getting one set of data, and the insiders who were managing to eke it out were managing to get a little bit drips and drabs. But Majestic-12, Bissell at the Directorate of Plans at the CIA are holding on to all of this information. Now, in the midst of all this happening and Ike being locked out and getting more and more frustrated, Dr. Donald Menzel, who had been on MJ-12 from the very beginning, writes a memo to JFK, who's a congressman at the time, remember. "When you get that pending security granted, there are things I want to talk with you about my work with the National Security Agency and these other activities." So Kennedy is read in, as they say. Kennedy knows about this. Otherwise, an MJ-12 member, Donald Menzel, would not be saying, "Hey, as soon as I'm allowed legally to do it, as soon as you have that top secret clearance, there are things that I need to tell you." The following year, Ike is so angry that he summons 2 FBI agents to the Oval Office. Nixon is there with him. So now Nixon is being read in. Okay? Ike inquires about ETs and crafts, saying that he's been denied any information now from MJ-12. They've completely cut him off. He's getting no information from Area 51 or S4. He's pissed off, and he wants these CIA agents to go. And if they can't get anything out of Area 51 S4, Ike threatens to storm Area 51 using the First Army out of Colorado. Can you imagine if Joe Biden said, "If I don't get the information that I want out of Lockheed Martin or out of this Air Force base or that Air Force base, I'm mobilizing the Army"? Because that's exactly what Ike was going to do. You couldn't do it today. These people have made absolute sure of it. But Ike was at the very, very top. He was the chief of staff of the U.S. Army. He was the Supreme Allied Commander in World War II. Ike had credentials that nobody has had before or since, and that was done on purpose. I guarantee you that. The CIA agents report back that they saw hangar doors, UFOs were behind them. They even saw EBEs at S4, which they partially interviewed. So now we know that there's at least one living EBE. But of course, Daniel Burridge said that he was working with J. Rod's Grays at S4. So there you go. So in January of 59, let's talk about 59 a little here. Robert Bissell, who set up Area 51, this is when he becomes the head of the Directorate of Plans. Again, he's rewarded. He's an insider. He's read in. He's a gatekeeper. So let's give him even more power. Why wouldn't we? Now, just prior to this, in July of 1958, NASA is formed, which one of my least favorite people in history, Werner von Braun, professed Nazi, hanging people from cranes. I know I've said it a million times. People need to remember this. He becomes the head of NASA. A year later, Wally Schirra, John Glenn, and a bunch of other guys are our first astronauts. Amongst them is a man named Gordon Cooper, Mercury and Gemini astronaut. He had seen UFOs in 1951, and in 1957, in May, had a very credible report, photographs by two guys he was with at Edwards Air Force Base, again, where Ike had met with these ETs prior, and all of that was buried. But Gordon Cooper now is read in. He knows the truth. He's the guy who's witnessed these things firsthand, not once but twice. So he is on the team. Another way to control information, although Cooper did come out eventually and talk about this stuff, okay? In May of 1959, a man named Stephen Lufkin, who is the White House Army Signals Agency, becomes very close to Ike. The Army Signals Agency is controlling all of the communications, the security and all, in and out of the White House. Any communications go through them. He confirmed Ike's knowledge of UFOs, of the ongoing compartmentalization, and the military-industrial complex. Stephen Lufkin did this through Greer's Disclosure Project. A lot of good information is flowing from that. Last month, or maybe June, another bunch of guys came forward, and I will share a lot with you, probably late winter into the spring on this special series. So, 1960. November 8th, JFK beats Nixon by the closest margin of history. Okay, they're both read-in guys. They both have teams that are supporting them. Nixon goes all the way back to the early days with Bush and all the other CIA stuff going on and all. He's a read-in guy. Could go either way, but they decide to go with Kennedy. A month later, JFK and Ike meet. They talk about, lots and lots of things, but also definitely the UFOs, what the Cold War program is being used for, so on and so forth. January 17th, so about 5 weeks later, Ike gives his farewell military-industrial complex speech. He mentions the armament industry. He says that what it's going to take is an alert and knowledgeable citizenry. I certainly count my audience, Craig's audience, as people who are trying to be an alert and knowledgeable citizenry. But we are in the minority. You know that. Still, almost 60% of people, about 40% of people still think all of this stuff is absolute just bunk and garbage. And that's 40% too many, quite frankly, especially with all these hearings and all going on. So 2 days later, after Ike's farewell address, warning people about the military-industrial complex, the infiltration of the Nazis, the reverse engineering, the power of MJ-12, Area 51, the CIA, and all of it is what he's talking about. JFK and Ike have a second meeting. A month later now, JFK is president. He issues Executive Order 10920, which abolishes the Operations Coordinating Board. I told you about that, right? That's Cold War PSYOPs. It's a successor to Truman's 1951 Psychological Strategy Board. And what Kennedy is doing is he's taking power away from MJ-12. He's taking power away from the CIA, and he's giving it over to his National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy, and the Department of State. they would be overseeing these kind of relationships with Russia and not the CIA, not Majestic-12. Now, at this time, who is on Majestic-12? This becomes really important for what's going to happen to Kennedy. Dulles is in charge. Edward Teller is there. Carter is there. Curtis LeMay, the very powerful war hawk general who told Barry Goldwater, as we've talked about on the show, when he said, hey, what can you tell me about UFOs? Don't effing ask me that question ever again. Don't do it. That was his response. Blake is still on there. Bronk is on there. Hunsinger, Frost, Gray, Menzel, Sanford, and Berkner. So most of them are the same guys other than, Curtis LeMay coming on board there. So February 22nd, 1961, JFK pledges cooperation with Khrushchev to work through U.S.-USSR hostilities. He wanted to solve the problem. He knew it was bad for the country, and he also knew that there was this larger problem. There were UFOs coming in. There were EBEs. There was contact. There was treaties. There was all this kind of stuff. Could these two countries afford not to work together? He thought absolutely no. But the country is against him. He has a really sour taste about Fidel Castro, about Che Guevara and all that. They're knocking heads all the time, saying horrible things about each other. The embargoes and all of that are happening. But before the embargo, Kennedy has all of the Cuban cigars bought up in Washington, D.C. I mentioned to you that before. So we have April 17th, 1961, CIA Operation Bay of Pigs. JFK did not want American involvement. He did want U.S. air support. We were going to help after the rebels who had been trained down in Miami, so on and so forth. And that gets all the people involved in the Kennedy assassination, which Craig and I will talk about at the appropriate time, are training all these guys. They're we're going to get rid of Castro. Sidney Gottlieb at the CIA, special projects guy, Dr. Poison. He's trying to knock off Fidel Castro almost all the time in different ways. Anyway, JFK is furious. Who does he blame? He blames Allen Dulles, head of Majestic-12, head of the CIA. The deputy director of the CIA, General Charles P. Cable. His brother Earl is the mayor of Dallas during the Kennedy assassination, folks. Right? Deputy director of the CIA, General Charles P. Cabell, who winds up resigning in shame because Kennedy blames him and all these other guys. We're going to talk about that during the assassination episode. So let's move on. And our old friend Robert Bissell, who's the head, set up Area 51, head of the Directorate of Plans. Now, here's something that I just found out today. It's not in the Sala book. I had never seen it before. Cobble and Bissell used the U2 program. Bissell was the head of the U2 program in his role at Area 51. They used the U2 program under orders from Allen Dulles to sabotage the Khrushchev-Eisenhower summit scheduled for May 16, 1960. These guys needed the Cold War. The military-industrial complex needed the Cold War. The contractors needed the Cold War. They needed to this damn day. They need their hot wars as well. They order an overflight, even though Eisenhower had said, I don't want any spy planes flying in May because I have this big summit with Khrushchev. Nope, that's the Francis Gary Powers incident, shot down, so on and so forth. That's 2 weeks before the summit was supposed to happen, and it was scrapped. Charles says, oh, yes, damn straight. These are the guys. Now, these are the foxes in the henhouse around Kennedy that he's now trying desperately to get rid of, okay? 5 days after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, JFK goes to Camp David to meet with Ike. With Forrestal gone, Ike is his mentor. Ike is his confidant. Ike is the guy that he is bouncing ideas off of. Powers was not expected to survive. That's right, Charles. But they got their way and the summit blew up. So there you go. April 27th, 1961, 5 days later, JFK speaks to the American Newspaper Publishers Association. I have read this to you before, and I'm going to keep reading it. I think he may have been sabotaged. I think they wanted the Russians to know about that program because they were going to be on to the next one. In 62, they had 3 new planes that were coming, so they were getting ready to retire the U-2 anyway, and it was meant for that. So this is what Kennedy says. Listen to these words. I can't believe every congressman who's trying to do disclosure should be reading this into the record. We are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. That is MJ-12 and the CIA in a nutshell. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumors printed, no secret revealed. It conducts the Cold War, in short, with a wartime discipline no democracy would ever hope or wish to match. Okay, that's April 27th. Fast forward exactly 2 months later, JFK directs the Pentagon to oversee CIA and look into MJ-12 through a national security memorandum. You can find this. In response, Dulles writes to 6 other MJ-12 members. So if you go back, it's the first 6 on that list, the most powerful, Teller, so on and so forth. And he says to them that we need to institute something called Project Environment. The weather is dry and it needs to be wet. A wet operation, anybody who knows anything about the CIA or the KGB will tell you, is an assassination operation. He wants these 6 guys to vote on it. He's leaving office. He's resigning from the CIA in November because he's on the outs with Kennedy. He needs to know by October. Okay, and this is the burn memo that wound up in all those MJ-12. Hi, Christy. Good evening. I'm glad you're here too. October 61, George Adamski allegedly meets. Now, he's the guy who supposedly is in contact with Venus, gets a medal from the Pope, is advising the Pentagon and European leaders. He allegedly meets with JFK and extends an invite for him to meet with the ETs in California. He tells them about a future world crisis. What happens exactly 1 year later? The Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, November 5th of 61, Dulles writes a top secret letter to JFK in response to this business about the Pentagon overseeing CIA operations. He wants them to come clean, saying that UFOs are nothing but psyops against Russia, disinformation. If there were off-world craft, though, they're not a national security threat. Okay, that's been used, except when you want to up budgets, and then you say, oh, hell yeah, they are a security threat, right? He refuses to tell JFK about MJ-12, which, as you know, he is currently heading. All right. 24 days later, Dulles resigns. But he's far from done. Now he's working in the shadows where he can be even more dangerous. Now, in 1962, Robert Kennedy gets UFO briefings from Lieutenant Philip Corso. Now, if you're a Roswell person, you know the name Lieutenant Philip Corso. He wrote a book called The Day After Roswell in 1997 about seeding alien technology into the private sector. This is what Greer's Disclosure Project is currently very focused on outing. Look, the friggin' technology is there. Let's use it for good before the planet dies. Okay. At the time, though, 1962, Corso is the head of the U.S. Army Foreign Technology Desk. Foreign technology. Not only our on-world adversaries, but our off-world adversaries. So he's briefing RFK. RFK is written and read into this whole thing. Okay, Corso is the military liaison to JFK when he abolished the Psychological Strategy Board Operations Coordinating Board. So Philip Corso knows a hell of a lot about all these psyops and UFO operations, in other words. All right. In March of 1962, JFK goes to Palm Springs. He visits Ike. Palm Springs was where Ike had initially disappeared when he went and met with the EBEs. After visiting Ike, JFK goes to Alameda Naval Air Station. He goes to Lawrence Berkeley Radiation Lab, and he goes to Vandenberg Air Force Base, named after one of the founding members of Majestic-12, Hoyt Vandenberg. Does he have a meeting with the ETs there? Was that set up by George Adamski? We don't know, but some researchers, including Sala, think that it is a possibility. Okay, August 5th of 62 is the death of Marilyn Monroe. Now, I'll talk about this in more detail after I'm done with you tonight. Tanya and I are going to watch a recent documentary about Marilyn's last days and her death. But I will tell you this. She was a security liability. She was sleeping with JFK. She was sleeping with RFK. Hoover was absolutely furious about it. Remember, Hoover is read in. He knows about the LA crash. He knows about the Roswell crash. And he's pissed because he is being left out in the cold by the CIA and Majestic-12. Hoover is pissed. He's like, you got to break it off. So the boys do. Marilyn is furious. She's despondent. They won't take her calls. She doesn't know what's going on. She has a diary that she's shown a bunch of people where she's kept detailed notes of her conversations about UFOs and Cuba and every other thing with the Kennedy boys, who were very fond of pillow talk with Marilyn. Okay. She threatens to have a press conference where she's going to out secret Cuba bases, all the other stuff going on, the truth about the operations, and the UFOs. She dies August 5th, 1962, loaded with barbiturates. There are rumors that RFK was there twice during the day with his brother-in-law, Peter Lawford, who was very close with Marilyn Monroe, and then he came back with a couple of LA police guys and maybe a CIA operative, a doctor who had a hypodermic loaded up, possibly to get Marilyn just to be compliant while he's looking for this journal. And there are secret wiretaps that were authorized where he's saying, where the hell is it? Where the F is it? We need it. My family needs it. So there you go. We're going to talk about that more in the future. Still doing more research on all of that. The info from the wiretaps of her home, those wiretaps were authorized by James Jesus Angleton, who was the head of counterintelligence for the CIA. Okay, October 16th through 29th, 62 is the Cuban Missile Crisis. A month later, Kennedy goes to Homestead Air Force Base in Florida, where he reportedly sees EBE bodies from the Roswell crash. Why does that sound familiar? I brought it up last week, and I'll bring it up when I do the 1970s. Nixon and Gleason, that's where they went to Homestead to see the EBE. So there is another confirmation. All right, 1963, that fateful year. May, Kennedy visits Forrestal's grave. Okay, his mentor. He goes to his grave. That's May 30th. A month later, JFK visits White Sands Missile Range, where the paperclip Nazis are set up. He goes to Fort Bliss, and he goes to Holloman Air Force Base, where the Greada Treaty was signed and where Ike met with the aliens at least twice. In September, JFK pushes for UFO files to be released from the CIA to NASA. He pledges cooperation with the USSR on space and lunar missions. Khrushchev initially declines, but he accepts November 11th, 2 months later, when the Soviet Mars mission fails, and he realized, hey, we really could use these guys' help. November 12th, a top secret memorandum is sent from JFK to the new CIA director, John McCone, regarding UFOs and national security. That very same day, JFK sends a memoranda to NASA administrator James Webb about cooperation with the Soviets, about the UFO problem, and he speaks to Khrushchev that very day, November 12th, 1963, 20 days before he is killed. November 20th, there's a McCone memo in reference to the UFOs, the files, the CIA, and it has handwriting on it by William Kobe, who went on to become CIA director, but then was pushed out by, this was during the Ford administration, but then was pushed out by Nelson Rockefeller and his cronies and Kissinger and all. And he wound up dying under mysterious circumstances several years later, Colby. Anyway, he was the CIA chief for the Far East Asia at the time, and he wrote, Angleton has MJ directive. This is 3 days before the assassination. What is that MJ directive? That was Alan Dulles's when he was being pushed out, and he said to the top 6 members, longstanding members of MJ-12, I need a vote on Project Environment. We need to go from dry to wet. What happens on November 22nd? In the town where the ex-deputy director of the CIA, who was also shamed, Charles Cabell, his brother Earl is mayor. They changed the routes. Kennedy is in an open-top car, and he is killed. More of that to come. So there you go. Hey, Tiffany, thank you for joining us. You can watch this on replay. I am done. Thanks for staying with me a couple extra minutes. Next week is City 40 with Craig, and then I'll be back doing the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, mixing in. Got so many great things coming up. So stay tuned. Watch for those banners, which we typically launch on Wednesdays, telling you what the next episode is. I have some pretty cool guests coming up, lining up more all the time. I have a stack of books I'm reading for upcoming guests. So take care, everyone. Peace, be well, and thank you so much for joining.